Welcome to the Topeka-Shawnee County League of Women Voters presentation, Redistricting 101. The League of Women Voters across the nation is working on a redistricting program called People-Powered Fair Maps to encourage every state to create fair maps during this round of redistricting. Of course, fairness is always a matter of perspective, but the League is most interested in its core value of being sure that every voice is heard in the democratic process. In Kansas, this program is taking two approaches. First is civic engagement and education to be sure that Kansans know what redistricting is, who does it, what the process involves, and the impact of new districts. Second is educating Kansans about opportunities to let their elected officials know how they would like to have their districts drawn. In both approaches, the League will focus on districts drawn for any type of representation from Congress to the City Council and local school districts. As with all the League's work, we encourage community members to work together and stay engaged with their local officials. During this presentation, we'll discuss the basics of redistricting, connection to the census and apportionment, gerrymandering and fairness factors, the process for redistricting in Kansas, and how you can make a difference. Three key activities are related to redistricting. It's important to know how they interconnect. The U.S. Census is conducted every 10 years to count the residents of the country. The census is required by the U.S. Constitution and has been conducted every 10 years since 1790. The census completed in years ending in 0 are the only actual enumerations of the U.S. population. Between those decennial counts, the Census Bureau issues population estimates based on surveys and statistical sampling. Some other agencies and local units of government conduct censuses for specific purposes, but the only official population figures are published by the U.S. Census Bureau. The second activity is apportionment. That's the process of allocating seats in Congress to each state. The seats in the U.S. House are not simply apportioned by dividing the nation's population by 435. Each state gets one representative regardless of population. Then a formula is used to apportion the remaining 385 seats. Usually the Census Bureau releases apportionment population counts by December 31st in the year of the census. Due to the pandemic and numerous administrative issues, the apportionment results were not released until yesterday. The Kansas number of seats in the House of Representatives did not change. The last time Kansas congressional representation changed was a result of the 1990 census when Kansas went from 5 to 4 congressional districts. The final activity and the process we will focus on in the rest of this presentation is redistricting, that is, creating districts from which representatives are elected. Once congressional seats are apportioned to the state, the legislature in Kansas is responsible for establishing districts of essentially equal population for election of the members of the U.S. House of Representatives from Kansas. The ideal population of each of those districts is the state population divided by 4, the number of representatives Kansas will have. Likewise, the ideal population for state house districts is the state population divided by 125, and the ideal state senate district population is the state population divided by 40. Cities, counties, and unified school districts in Kansas that elect representatives from districts also will redistrict based on the 2020 census. As many of you know, the legislature did not adopt new districts in 2012, so the U.S. District Court drew the districts that have been used since 2012 to elect our representatives to Congress, the legislature, and the State Board of Education. Thus, you might hear people say that the court conducted the 2012 round of redistricting. So what can we expect in terms of changes in the district maps of Kansas in order to preserve the ideal district populations? On this map, you see estimates of deviation from the ideal size for the current congressional districts based on the 2019 population estimates. These figures will change when we receive the detailed census figures later this summer or fall. If these numbers hold or something like them, we will see that the first and the second congressional districts need to change the most, need to grow in order to encompass more territory to pick up enough population to attain ideal size. The third district in the Kansas City metropolitan area will shrink to shed population, and the fourth district will likely need to grow a bit, but not anywhere near as much as the two other districts that encompass large amounts of rural territory. While the Kansas population overall did not grow much since 2010, about 3%, the population in urban and suburban areas continues the historical trend of growing significantly more than the state average. The green Senate districts on the map show the areas of growth. As this map of estimated population change illustrates, not all urban areas grew at the same rate. For instance, two of the three Topeka districts, 18 and 19, are too small and need to grow, while District 20 on the west side of Topeka and out into the neighboring county is about right. Also, as this map shows, the area around the Kansas City metro area and extending all the way west to Lawrence need to get smaller, as does the district that includes Manhattan. In the Wichita area, we see the classic development of a shrinking city area and a growing suburban exurban ring. We won't know the exact impact of population change on individual districts until the state receives the detailed census results in late summer or early fall. The Kansas legislature is responsible for drawing districts for 4 seats in Congress, 125 members of the Kansas House of Representatives, and 40 state senators. The State Board of Education districts are each formed from 4 contiguous Senate districts comprising the 10 members of the state board. Note that Kansas law provides that if districts are completed on or after May 11th, the primary filing date moves to June 10th. In this slide, we see a diagram of the overview of the process that the Kansas legislature will use to enact congressional, legislative, and state board of education districts. The whole process starts with the census count, which is done every 10 years. In the case of congressional districts, Kansas receives notification of its number of seats allocated in the apportionment process. The legislature, with the more detailed numbers, draws congressional districts and puts those in a bill that go through the legislative process and to the governor, just like any other bill, to be considered for veto or signing. If the governor vetoes the bill, like any other, it goes back to the legislature. If the governor signs the bill, the districts will be used in the 2022 election, barring any challenge of the maps in court. In the case of the legislature and the State Board of Education, the legislature uses the census figures to draw the Senate, House, and Board of Education districts, puts those in a bill. They go through the legislative process, go to the governor to be considered for veto or signing. If they're vetoed, back to the legislature and through again. If they are signed by the governor, the Attorney General will petition the Kansas Supreme Court to determine the validity of the maps, and that's in accordance with the Kansas Constitution. The Supreme Court will take a look at those maps, usually on an expedited basis, and rule them either invalid, in which case they go back to the legislature and through the process again, or valid, in which case they're used for the 2022 election. It is these election dates that kick off in June of 2022 that set a realistic drop-dead date, if you will, on completing the legislative process of making new districts. During redistricting, the legislature has traditionally provided opportunities for input from the public so that legislators know their constituents' preferences for the makeup of districts. In 2011, the Joint Special Committee on Redistricting held public meetings in 14 cities across Kansas. The special committee was composed of the members of the House Redistricting Committee and Senate Apportionment Committee, and sought public input on what citizens of Kansas wanted from the redistricting process. Public meetings were held in Chanute, Colby, Dodge City, Garden City, Hayes, Hutchinson, Kansas City, Lawrence, Leavenworth, Manhattan, Overland Park, Pittsburgh, Salina, and Wichita. Members of the League of Women Voters presented testimony at 4 of the hearings. The League is interested in expanding opportunities for public input to the redistricting process. Generally, public input focuses on making the committees aware of communities of interest. Communities of interest have been described in Kansas redistricting guidelines in the past, much as they were defined in 2012, as shown on the slide. Communities of interest are often vague and best understood by showing where they are on a map and describing what interests specifically the population of the area shares. In the case of congressional districts that cover large areas of the state, communities of interest may be defined in terms of entire counties or regions. In the case of House and Senate districts, communities of interest may be as small as a neighborhood, a grade school attendance area, or an area defined by natural infrastructure boundaries such as rivers, highways, or railroads. Other communities of interest may be defined by other types of districts such as neighborhood improvement areas, school districts, or special taxing districts. Informing elected officials about existing communities of interest and how they might be impacted by redistricting is an important aspect of public input to the process. You might well ask, what is fair redistricting? In the words of Virginia Case, the chief executive of the League US, making sure that people feel their votes matter. That's what we hear from people all over the country. Because of the way maps are cracked or packed, people squashed together, many voters are not represented fairly. So let's unpack that statement just a little bit. The League's position on redistricting is that the League supports redistricting processes and enforceable standards that promote fair and effective representation at all levels of government with maximum opportunity for public participation. So let's dig down one more level in that statement. The League supports one person, one vote, or equal population, the principle that's articulated by the U.S. Supreme Court for all districts from which voters select their representatives. The League also holds that fair representation requires districts that are contiguous, that do not favor one party over another, that preserve communities of interest, and that split as few cities and counties as possible. Finally, the League recognizes that compactness and political competitiveness may also be legitimately considered while drawing new districts, but places those criteria far below others in order of priority. The League opposes 2 relatively common practices in redistricting. That is, incumbent protection, accomplished by essentially working around incumbents' home precincts. Often this practice takes the form of drawing districts so that probable election opponents are drawn out of the incumbent's district. The other practice frowned upon by the League is consideration of partisan data, voter party affiliation, or vote results during map drawing. Both of these practices have become simpler since the use of geographic information systems became widely used for redistricting beginning in the 1990s. Note that the use of political party data, either partisan election results or registration data, is necessary to assess whether a district is competitive. Kansas has developed what can be thought of as traditional redistricting criteria that have been used to guide map drawing since the late 1980s. These criteria are found neither in the state constitution nor in statute. They have been adopted by redistricting committees each decade as guidelines. As such, the criteria are not binding, except to the extent that they echo requirements of case law. Each of the criteria here that are checked off, the use of the U.S. Census, numerical equality of population in the districts. For congressional districts, that means essentially no deviation from the ideal. And for legislative districts, the common rule of thumb is plus or minus deviation from the ideal of 5%. Compact and contiguous districts, no purpose or effect of diluting minority voting strength. Districts built from census voting districts, which for all intents and purposes are precincts in Kansas. Preserving city and county lines to the extent possible, recognizing communities of interest, and making districts that are easily identifiable and understandable by voters. Two criteria that have been used in Kansas in the past would be rejected by the League. One is that of avoiding contests between members of the legislature or the State Board of Education and inclusion of voter registration information. The most unfair practices in redistricting are often lumped together under the term gerrymandering, the creation of district boundaries to disadvantage a particular group. As this slide notes, gerrymandering focuses on winning elections rather than on fair representation. Gerrymandering in Kansas traditionally focused on political party or urban-rural population characteristics. Gerrymandering is often used also in the context of splitting or packing racial and ethnic groups. While the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was established to protect voters against voter suppression tactics like racial gerrymandering, we know that it still happens, impacting not just who and where people can vote, but how and if communities of interest are represented. In the creation of Kansas congressional districts, racial gerrymandering is less an issue than in some other states. That's because while non-whites and Hispanic residents of Kansas comprise nearly a quarter of the population based on the 2019 population estimates, that's almost enough for a congressional district. Those segments of the population are not in a single area, so creating a majority-minority congressional district in Kansas would be virtually impossible. There's not a single racial or ethnic group other than white to make up a majority in the state or in any one congressional district. Non-white and Hispanic residents reside across the state. Finney, Ford, Seward, Grant, and Wyandotte counties are the only Kansas counties estimated to have a majority, that's more than 50%, non-white population, and are across the state from one another. However, as the court noted regarding congressional districts in its 2012 opinion in the redistricting case, quote, Wyandotte County should be placed in a single district so that the voting power of its large minority population may not be diluted. The situation is quite different when one looks at state house and Senate districts, though. Studies of voting behavior in Kansas have shown that voting is often racially polarized, meaning voters tend to vote as a bloc based on race or ethnicity. If bloc voting has continued, as documented in the past, there are a few areas of the state where it might be possible to create districts that would contribute to more minority representatives in the Kansas legislature. Those areas include Wyandotte, Shawnee, Sedgwick, Geary, Finney, Ford, and Seward counties. In its 2012 opinion in the redistricting case, the court noted that it created Senate District 4 in Wyandotte County and 38, including Ford and Seward counties, but not Finney County in southwest Kansas, by taking racial and ethnic makeup of the population into account, along with other aspects of communities of interest and the historic makeup of the districts. The court applied a similar analysis when it drew House Districts 34 and 35 in Wyandotte County. We likely also will see a change in the racial and ethnic makeup of the population figures used for redistricting in Geary, Riley, and Douglas counties due to inclusion of more students and members of the military for this round of state house and Senate redistricting. In Southwest Kansas, age and citizenship status of the Hispanic population complicates the analysis to some degree. It remains to be seen whether the 2020 census will reveal significant changes over prior years. This is an area that advocates for fair districts need to be mindful of and monitor closely. You might very well ask, how can I get involved? Well, the very best way to be involved at this stage is to talk to your legislators about setting up a fair process that has ample opportunity for public input to the redistricting process. In terms of what the legislature should do, first of all, it needs to develop clear guidelines and criteria for both congressional and legislative districts and use those criteria to assess redistricting plans. The guidelines and criteria should set the stage for better and greater fairness in the outcome of redistricting. The legislature should end the practice of including partisan and incumbent home seat information in the redistricting database, also to encourage greater fairness. And the legislature should be encouraged to adopt new districts early during the 2022 session to ensure adequate time for the Supreme Court to review the districts and to ensure smooth preparation for the 2022 election. In addition, the legislature should be encouraged to conduct public hearings virtually and in person across the state during the summer and fall of 2021. They should also make it easy for the public to submit maps and testimony describing communities of interest. They should provide that all district plans submitted be publicly available along with a uniform set of reports to assist with analysis and comparison. And the legislature should provide clear timelines and instructions for submitting district maps at hearings. Thank you for your attention. For more information, see the League of Women Voters of Topeka-Shawnee County website.